I mean, I was excited about the Elon Musk takeover even before I got back. I was just thrilled at witnessing the meltdown online. I was really enjoying the panicking and the flouncing. Like, we'll have to start a new social media platform. It's like, good luck. Like, we tried that so hard for the past 4 years. I mean, so many of these people on Twitter, the blue ticks, as you called them, they would be complete unknowns if not for Twitter.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Meghan Murphy. Meghan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a long time since you and I last spoke, and I feel like a lot has happened. Most notably, I think, your return to Twitter. I find this story fascinating from beginning to end, and I would like to talk about it for a little bit. So many listeners will know that you were one of the first feminists to be thrown off Twitter, to be banished from that social media platform for the speech crime of misgendering someone, i.e. you used male pronouns to refer to a male person who fantasizes that he's actually a woman. And your case became a bit of a cause celeb amongst certain free speech activists, and particularly amongst feminists who want the right to talk about biological sex. At one point, you even launched a court case against Twitter to try and have your account reinstated. And it looked for a long time like there was no hope. There was no way Meghan Murphy, the TERF, the witch, was ever going to get back on Twitter. And now you're back on Twitter, courtesy of Elon Musk's freedom of speech rampage, as we might refer to it, and also courtesy of your friend Joe Rogan, who put in a good word for you. You're actually back on that platform. So I want to start off by asking you, were you surprised when you got back on? How does it feel to be back in Twitter after all these years?
It feels amazing. I miss Twitter so much. I am not and never have been one of those people who hated Twitter. I always loved Twitter, and I was genuinely very sad when they banned me. Not just because it has had an immense impact on my work. I'm fully independent. I work for myself. I do everything myself. I produce my own writing. I produce my own podcast. I run my own website. There's no other company that I work for. So it's sort of my job, my responsibility to promote my work, to contact interviewees, to engage with my audience, et cetera, et cetera. So it really was devastating to me, which I know sounds silly to some people who might think, it's just social media, who cares? But when you work in media, it matters a lot. It's not just fun, although I do find Twitter fun. Twitter is, as far as I'm concerned, like the best place for trolling and jokes, which I enjoy. As well as, for participating in the conversation. This is, for better or for worse, maybe for worse, the public square. And I can't believe it was 4 years. It was the end of 2018 that I was banned, and I fought and fought and fought in every way that I possibly could. I appealed probably like a dozen times. Most of my appeals were ignored. Some I received a response that, was just a forum response that reiterated the initial forum response that I got, which was that I had been banned for breaking Twitter rules or banned for hateful conduct. They never, ever, ever specified which rule I broke. I can guess. I know what the Twitter executives have said about me publicly, which were lies. But they said that I was harassing trans people on Twitter, which is not true. And of course, the day that I was banned from Twitter, it was a Friday night. I think it was the end of November. It was Friday night. And just a couple hours after I was banned, after I received this email saying that I was permanently banned, Pink News published an article saying that Twitter had implemented a new rule against dead naming and misgendering. So to me, it was obvious what I was being taken down for from the get-go, because they were going after my tweets questioning gender identity ideology. Again, really not saying anything offensive per se, which is not to say that I've never said anything rude or offensive on Twitter. I mean, I'm not out there just to be nice all the time, I suppose. But, you know, the tweets that they went after were not egregious in any way at all. I was pretty surprised to get back. I had hoped that my Twitter account would be reinstated once Elon Musk took over, and appealed a couple times after he took over in the hopes that their systems would change, their processes would change. But on some level, I had kind of given up. And I had, you know, I had rebuilt from the bottom up in some ways. When I was banned from Twitter, I had to like start a public Instagram account and start a public Facebook page and get a YouTube channel going. I hadn't done any of that before. I had really mostly just used Twitter and Facebook a little bit, but not really. I don't like Facebook. And I mean, I didn't want to spend all my time on social media. I want to do my work. I don't want to be on, 5 different social media platforms plugging away. But I had managed to build back up again. The fact that I was able to sort of rebuild an audience in all these new places from scratch had to do in part with, I worked. I worked a lot, but I always worked a lot. But because I was banned, in some ways it could be considered a blessing in disguise, although I didn't like it in any way, but it did get a lot of media attention. It did get into these debates around free speech and, what social media is for, and how social media shapes the public conversation, how social media shapes politics, how social media shapes ideology and really can manipulate public perception on issues. And thanks to people like Joe Rogan, who did, he advocated for me for a long time. And then going on, he has the biggest platform in the entire world. So going on his show has a major impact, obviously, on visibility.
I think that's a very good summary of what's happened. I want to talk a little bit about just how serious your case was. And in my mind, I remember reading about it all those 4 years ago and subsequently and writing about it sometimes as well, because I thought it was really striking, because up until that point, really, the discussion had primarily been around banning alt-right accounts and far-right accounts and people who are genuinely hateful or say things that most people would consider to be pretty repulsive or wrong or immoral. By the way, I don't think those people should be banned either, but that was where the discussion really was. And then we had your case where we had a feminist, a left-leaning feminist, although we'll come on to in a moment who's left-wing, who's right-wing, and what all that stuff means these days. But we had someone like you being taken off for criticizing one man in particular, Jonathan Yaniv, who also goes by the name Jessica Yaniv, who's a pretty terrible character in Canada, who was trying to pressure largely immigrant beauticians to wax his testicles, essentially, and then taking them to a human rights tribunal when they refused to do so. And at least one of the reasons that you were marked out as a bad person on Twitter who should be censored is because you referred to Jonathan Yaniv as him. Your famous tweet where you said men aren't women, though, that's one of the tweets that you were really harangued for. And I love the fact that your first tweet upon your return to Twitter was the exact same, men aren't women, though. That's great. But isn't it just extraordinary and really telling about the crazy politics of the Twitter executive board that you could have a situation where a rational feminist like yourself was being censored, at least in part, for daring to offend a pretty dreadful man who was openly harassing immigrant women?
Right. The whole thing would be insane as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Either way, even if this individual in question weren't this really horrible predator, he was predating on women and allegedly on girls. He was trying to extort money out of these immigrant women, these estheticians who were working out of their homes, It was a grift. It was a grift. I mean, I don't believe there's such a thing as a trans person. I don't think that the trans concept is coherent. I don't think that you can be neither male or female. I don't think you can change sex. But that aside, as you know, he was contacting these estheticians. I'm certain that he chose these individuals in particular to target. He wasn't contacting, salons that were sort of fancy and had more money. He was contacting immigrant women who were, English as a second language, particularly vulnerable, marginalized women working out of their homes who definitely would not want a naked man in their space alone with them. He was asking them to wax his balls. He was asking for a Brazilian bikini wax. And when they said no, realizing that he was male, which he knew would happen, he still had his male face all over his social media profiles. He was in no way even attempting at that time to look like a woman. I'm saying this in quotations. When they said no, he threatened to sue them for discrimination. And I think some of them did kind of pay him some money, as I have heard from some of their lawyers and what and so on and so forth. And the rest of them, he dragged through this human rights tribunal, which was, as I'm sure anyone can imagine, very stressful and costly. Some of these women lost their businesses. And this is the guy that I was supposedly, that I was banned for life until Elon and Joe lended me a helping hand. I was banned for life for calling this guy he. And he, at that time, was using the pronouns he in various places online. Like, he was misgendering himself.
It was genuinely crazy. And as I say, one of the most striking cases of censorship. And I wanted to, just to bring it on to the broader discussion about Twitter and freedom of speech, I think you mentioned earlier how you're very happy to be back on Twitter. And when you were on it originally, pre-2018, it was incredibly useful for you as a writer, as someone who wanted to get your ideas around and your articles around. It's a very useful tool. One thing that I have found quite sinister since Elon Musk took over is, in the response to Elon Musk taking over, is you have all these blue tick accounts who for many years were saying, look, people like Meghan Murphy aren't actually being censored. They're just being taken off a privately owned platform. They can go somewhere else. They can use a different platform. They could maybe even create their own platform. That was one of the big rallying cries for quite some time. And there was this very slippery, disingenuous claim that if you're thrown off Twitter, it's not really censorship. It doesn't really hurt you. You can still speak your mind. But what I found since Musk took over, and these people are really panicking about Twitter going down or collapsing, is now lots of them are saying the precise opposite of that. They're saying, look, we don't want to lose Twitter. It's so important to us. This is how I became a well-known person. This is how I got on a TV show or had someone read a piece that I wrote. So they were essentially lying for all those years when they were saying Twitter's not important, it's just a private company and you follow the rules or else you go somewhere else. That element of it, I think, has been quite sinister, because at root, weren't a lot of these people who were campaigning for the censorship of people like you and others as well, they knew what they were doing, didn't they? They knew that they were protecting their own space and their own ideology from those who would dare to intrude on it and raise different questions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that these people are completely disingenuous. And as you say, they were lying. I mean, to pretend that Twitter is no big deal, but then to bank your entire identity and voice and career on Twitter at the same time is completely disingenuous. I mean, so many of these people on Twitter, the blue ticks, as you called them, they would be complete unknowns if not for Twitter. There's a ton of people who appear to be very powerful in terms of the public conversation who aren't really doing much beyond tweeting, who managed to build up a huge, massive following which is it is powerful. You know, the thing that's different about Twitter versus the other social media platforms is that your words can travel so far in an instant. And the other places like Instagram and Facebook don't really function in that same way. And, you know, there is a monetary value attached, which I'm sure the supposed anti-capitalists don't want to acknowledge, although, of course, they're not anti-capitalist in any way at all. But the leftists who pretend to be, you know, socialist, et cetera, anti-corporation. I mean, first of all, it takes a lot of work to build up a big following on Twitter. And second of all, that's how you get opportunities nowadays in many ways, which is, I think, a bit unfortunate. But I mean, I'm sure you know as well as anyone, you know, if you're a writer, you're much more likely to be able to publish your work, to publish articles, if the places that you're freelancing for or writing for know that they'll get clicks. You know, that's valuable now. We work online for the most part, and that's how things work. So it's really, and as you say, as soon as Elon Musk took over and they all started panicking that the platform would disappear or maybe turn into something where they didn't have the same kind of power and control, they started tweeting about how, you know, this is my whole career. You know, I've worked all these years to build up this following, and everything could just disappear in a second. And I was like, oh, really? Tell me about it. Tell me about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, like, it's unbelievable.
That really was an incredible insight into how their minds work and into just the blasé authoritarianism that they have been engaged in for so many years, where they knew perfectly well that expelling someone from Twitter would have quite severe consequences for their ability to make a living, their ability to make an impact. They knew that all along. It's so clear now. Just sticking with the Twitter thing for a moment, I wanted to get your view on the broader Musk era. I mean, obviously you've benefited directly from the Musk era already. I'm enjoying watching it. I think the meltdown that people are having is just very entertaining and very revealing. They can't abide the fact that there will be more freedom of speech on Twitter because they were so invested in the structures of censorship that had been built up over the past few years. And they benefited from those structures of censorship too, particularly on the trans issue, in fact. A lot of trans activists knew that on Twitter they could very easily have women in particular just instantly banned by mass reporting them for telling biological truths. And they exploited that system to censor women in a way that I think was very authoritarian and often quite misogynistic as well. But in relation to the Musk era, I'm guessing you think this is a pretty good thing in terms of his reinstatement of an element of freedom of speech and his willingness to take a risk in terms of allowing different voices on Twitter. But alongside that, do you think there's a danger that we find ourselves once again relying on a powerful billionaire to give us the right to speak freely when it ought to be a right that we enjoy simply by being adults in free societies?
Yeah, I mean, I was excited about the Elon Musk takeover even before I got back. I was just thrilled at witnessing the meltdown online. I was really enjoying the panicking and the flouncing and these people now trying to go off to Mastodon or whatever. Like, we'll have to start a new social media platform. It's like, good luck. Like, we tried that so hard for the past 4 years. Unfortunately, like, I wish it did work because I think that more platforms would be useful, but it just doesn't seem to. None of them seem to take off in the way that Twitter has, of course. I mean, I believe that Elon Musk really does care about and value free speech. And so I trust this billionaire more than others, perhaps. But of course, you're right. And I think that a lesson that I hope that we have learned and that I've learned is to not, you know, put all of our money in one place, you know, not to bank on this one platform for our speech. I hope, although I don't know that this will play out, I hope that we've also learned how important it is to protect free speech. I mean, one of the things that I learned from my banning, because I was banned from Twitter, I was connected with people like you, for example, and others who had been advocating for free speech for a long time. Toby Young, people on the right who were advocating for free speech for a long time. People like Ben Shapiro, and people who I really hadn't engaged with much prior. And, I think that at that time I had sort of started to defend free speech more strongly than I had in the past. I hate to admit it, but it just wasn't something I really thought about very much. I don't think Canadians do. I'm Canadian. I don't live in Canada anymore, but I lived there for 40 years. And free speech is not defended in Canada the way that it is in America. We don't seem to understand how pivotal it is, which is really dangerous, especially now that we're dealing with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who is going after free speech. He's working to pass a bill C-11, right now. He's been trying to push this bill through for, I think, a year or two now, that would curb so-called online hate speech. He's trying to force platforms like YouTube, for example, to control Canadian content and take down content that doesn't fall in line with, his political ideology, essentially, although he doesn't frame it in that way, but that's the truth. And I'm grateful that I learned this lesson, although I wish that I had learned it much earlier in my life. And so since my banning, I've really switched my focus in terms of politics to the fight for free speech and to try to show people that free speech is for everyone. You hear people saying things like, I support free speech, but not racist speech or not classist speech or not misogynist speech. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. Yeah. Like, it's everything. It's everything, except for, I think, overt threats of violence and genocide. I think that everything else goes. And I think we just have to deal with that. Society is messy. People are messy. And I think that's healthier than the alternative, which would be a dictatorship.
Yeah.
I think, you'd hope people would understand why censorship and why controlling speech in this way, for political purposes is dangerous, but so many people don't seem to get it.
Hi, this is Fraser here, Deputy Editor of Spiked. I know a lot of parents are really worried about how easy it is for kids to access social media and the internet these days. So it's surprising to me that in 2022, more parents haven't installed ExpressVPN on their kids' devices. I mean, you wouldn't let your kids walk home from school without telling them not to talk to strangers. So why would you let them go online without using ExpressVPN? So why does every family need a VPN, you may wonder? Well, it's because all devices, phones, computers, laptops, tablets, have unique IP addresses, which is a bit like an internet phone number. This can reveal all kinds of personal information about you, such as your location. It's incredibly simple for a stranger online to find your IP address. If you've ever clicked a dodgy link or opened an email with a bugged image, your IP address could easily be exposed. And that could be especially worrying if you have a family. ExpressVPN is an app that hides your real IP address and replaces it with a dummy one, keeping you safe and private. And it's so easy to use. You just download the ExpressVPN app on your phone or computer, you tap one button to turn it on, and you're protected. Even a 10-year-old can figure it out. And here's the coolest part about ExpressVPN. They let you choose what country you want your IP address to look like it's coming from. This is super useful because services like Netflix and Disney Plus give you different shows depending on what country you're in. Kids love this because when they're trying to stream films or television, they can just switch their country and get hundreds of extra shows for free. By switching your country to, say, the US, you can access fantastic family-friendly movies like the Harry Potter series that you'd have to pay for in the UK. So, secure your family's online activity and unlock tons of new shows by visiting expressvpn.com/Brendan. Use this link and you can get 3 months extra for free. That's expressvpn.com/Brendan. Go to expressvpn.com/Brendan to learn more.
I think actually quite a few people have come around to the case for freedom of speech as a result of the trans issue and the open censorship that has been taking place of feminists in particular who've dared to raise points about this new ideology and the threat that it poses to women, to gay people, to children. And I think quite a few feminists in the UK as well, who weren't always particularly favorable towards freedom of speech, I must say, have discovered that it is actually the most important principle in a democratic society. And here in the UK, as you've just described in Canada, we also sadly don't take freedom of speech as seriously as they do in the United States. We also have a bill going through, the online safety bill, which would make certain speech more difficult to carry out on the internet. We also have non-crime hate incidents where people can be visited by the police, even if they haven't committed a crime, but have said something supposedly hateful. And of course, that has involved visiting feminists who dare to refer to men as men and so on. So we are in a pretty bad position still in terms of censorship, but I do think more people are waking up to that. On that issue, I wanted to ask you about the left and the left's attitude to these things, because one thing that I've been noticing over the past 2 decades really is that sadly the left is often at the forefront of arguing for censorship these days, and sometimes the right is at the forefront of making, at least partially making, the case for freedom of speech, which is a bit of a turnaround from the past and from sections of the 20th century, when it was very often the right who would demand the censorship of certain forms of art, certain forms of political behavior, and the left tended to be a bit more countercultural, a bit more liberal. That shift is quite worrying, isn't it, in terms of the left becoming a more authoritarian instrument in society?
It's very strange. I can't stand hypocrisy. And so, of course, it's troubling when anyone advocates for censorship. And as you say, it used to be really the Christian right who were going after art, hip hop, for example, film, things like that. And we've done almost a full 180, wherein it's the left who are trying to censor anyone who doesn't toe their preferred narrative, who doesn't support their politics. And it's scary because they don't seem to see the big picture. And you can see this in terms of what happened on Twitter and what their response was, because I and others tried to warn them, to their benefit, to everyone's benefit, to say, you're not always going to be in power. Like right now, you're on the so-called right end of the political spectrum, not literally the right, but, the correct end, the popular end, the mainstream end. Your words are supported. Your views are supported. But what makes you think that that's permanent? What makes you think that someone else won't be in power next year and that they'll want to censor you? And you supported censorship and you advocated against free speech, and now you don't have it. And now you're the one who's being persecuted. For example, now you thought you had this permanent power on Twitter, for example, on social media, online, to control the conversation. Now suddenly you're faced with different opinions. I mean, they're not being censored at this point, but they're behaving as though they are, because they have to deal with criticisms and challenges and people who don't wholeheartedly agree with everything they tweet. But, it's like, oh, did the tables turn just like we said they would? Just like we tried to warn you about? I say this to feminists all the time, because it makes me so angry that so many feminists refuse to support free speech. They'll support free speech for them, but for no one else. And they don't get it. And it drives me insane. Like, so many feminists are essentially woke, are essentially enmeshed in woke politics, except when it comes to the issue of gender identity. And then, speech for women. And I support free speech for women. And I'll say, yes, I want to advocate for free speech for women, but not just for women and not just on this issue. That is not how this works.
Yeah.
And I truly don't understand how they don't see that you can just fight for your own speech, but for no one else's.
Yeah, I just think that is such an essential point. I mean, in many ways, that is the key point of freedom of speech. I mean, the first principle of freedom of speech is that if you want to enjoy it yourself, you have to defend it for everybody, as you say, including for people who you really hate, whose ideas you hate. It's more than 200 years since Thomas Paine said that if you want to make your own liberty secure, you must guard even your enemy from oppression. I mean, genuinely liberal thinkers have known this for a very long time, and it drives me mad as well when people don't realize how important that is. I think the feminist example is a good one, because here in the UK over the past few years, lots of gender critical feminists have found themselves being blacklisted from universities, being no platformed because their ideas are apparently dangerous and fascistic and so on. And the truth of the matter is that they are being banned from campuses under rules that they themselves have supported in the past, when they were being aimed at literal fascists or people on the far right, or misogynistic speech. That's also been targeted in British universities as well. And some feminists either turned a blind eye to that or actively supported it. And it's the perfect example, because they're now being swept up in censorious rules and regulations that they themselves backed in the past. So it's a really salient lesson, I think, on the importance of defending free speech across the board. I wanted to ask you specifically about feminists, and following on from the point you've just made there, I wanted to ask you about what's happening in the world of TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, the witches of the modern era. There is an interesting divide emerging, I think, particularly in the UK, which, as we know, is TERF Island, according to some publications. And that divide is between the supposedly respectable wing of TERFs who think that they're making the key and the important case for the right to talk about biological sex and to defend same-sex rights. And they rather look down their noses on people like Kelly J. Keane, otherwise known as Posey Parker. They might even look down their noses at you to a certain extent. I don't know, who they see as rabble-rousers, too willing to rub shoulders with people on the right, too willing to go on Fox News. There has become a bit of a purity battle between sections of TERFdom. I wonder, have you followed that? And what's your view on that?
I have followed that, and I've been enmeshed in that, and I've been counseled by, countless feminists because of my willingness to speak up for free speech for everyone, including anti-feminist speech, as they might call it. I'm willing to talk to all sorts of people across the political spectrum. And I'm not just saying that like, oh, I'm so generous. This is how we learn. I've learned so much about people and the world and politics, and changed my mind about a lot of things from exposure to different views. And people who I would have written off, 5-10 years ago. And I think that feminists who won't talk to different kinds of people they might label right wing, whether or not they actually are right wing is up for debate. I find these categories of left and right sort of don't make much sense anymore. But they would gain something by talking to these people. But I don't think they want to. Like, I think that the point of refusing to speak to, people that they label right, whether that's Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, I don't know. Some of them even seem to think that Joe Rogan is right wing, which I think is ridiculous. You probably get this accusation too, despite the fact that you're clearly not right wing. I think that they do it for the same reasons people refuse to engage with me in good faith, which is to dehumanize. It's so that you don't really have to consider these people as human beings who might actually be well-intentioned. It's preferable to say, this person is bad and evil. I don't want anything to do with them. It's easier to just hate them and to refuse to engage with any of their words or who they are as a full human being, than it is to sit down and have a conversation with them and be forced to admit that maybe you actually like this person. Maybe you won't. Maybe you'll find out that this person is an asshole or a creep, but maybe you'll like them. Maybe you'll find that you have some things in common. Maybe you'll learn that their views aren't so horrible. I have friends who are Republican. I have friends who are Christian. I have friends who are pro-life. And I've always been pro-choice, and I think I always will be. I don't want to say that, for certain, because you never know. I mean, I've changed my mind about so many things. It could happen. But I was interested in hearing what these people had to say about abortion, about why they were pro-life. When it came down to it, I disagreed. I didn't think that those were strong or good arguments. I have a different perspective on women's bodily autonomy and sovereignty. But they're not necessarily, some of them, I mean, not my friends, but some people who are pro-life might be shitty people, but these people they're good people, and they just see things different than me. And I don't know what more to say beyond that. I don't see why it's my responsibility to defend every single view a person that I speak with has. Like a person that I'm interviewed by, that I interview, that I'm friends with, who I sit on a panel with. It's not how the world works. If these people think that they can exist in these tiny political bubbles, I think they need to get out more. It's not healthy. It's dangerous. It's created this super divided society. I mean, we see it in the US, we see it in Canada, where people hate each other. Justin Trudeau turned Canada against itself. We have a more divided country than ever before because he vilified people who challenged his policies and what he was doing to people, which, he was taking away people's constitutional rights. He froze people's bank accounts who were political dissidents. And he told Canada that these people were terrorists and misogynists and Nazis and racists. And these were just regular working class Canadians. I've gone off on a bit of another tangent, but, the best way to create like a healthy, respectful society where we respect one another is to engage with people who are different than us and to have conversations with people and to treat one another as human beings and not as these, one-dimensional characters who are either good or evil.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a very good description of the humanizing dynamic of freedom of speech. Firstly, it makes one aware that people aren't monsters for the most part. They're actually just people who have a different point of view to oneself sometimes. And it's worth talking to them. It's worth engaging with them. It's worth having those good faith discussions about where people disagree and so on. Whereas, as you say, if people live in a bubble or if they live in an echo chamber, they tend to become more dogmatic. They tend to hold on to their views, not because they've tested them out in the free public realm, but simply because they presume that they are correct. And that's when people's views can become very ossified, almost religious, something that they cleave to in a very dogmatic fashion. And it does generate conflict and tension and sometimes hatred, as you describe. I think your points there about Canada and Justin Trudeau and his war on the Canadian truckers, that's not going off on a tangent, actually, because in fact, I wanted to ask you about some of that. You wrote a very good piece for Spiked earlier this year, headlined Why I Left the Left. And it's a really good argument that basically says, look, at a certain point, you just realize that we can't keep saying there are just a few bad apples on the left. We have to recognize that the left has lost the plot. It's no longer pro-working class in the way that it traditionally has been. It's no longer particularly egalitarian. It certainly isn't interested in freedom very much. It's become a very eccentric, woke, upper middle class movement that has authoritarian impulses. And I wanted to ask you about that in relation to the Canadian truckers, because the thing that really disturbed me about that was the way in which large sections of the left fell in line behind Trudeau's crusade, which was just tyrannical. You mentioned there the freezing of bank accounts, which is just an extraordinary step for a government to take. That was a very eye-opening moment, wasn't it? I mean, I know you had known for some time that the left was losing the plot, but when they fall in line behind such a horrible, illiberal crusade against working class people who simply want the freedom to make a living, that's when we really need to have a reckoning with what the left has become. Right.
And I mean, what we witnessed when the Freedom Convoy happened, when the truckers, got together and started fighting back against these nonsensical lockdowns and mandates, was what many of us already knew, but it became glaringly obvious and undeniable that the left has become a movement of elites.
Yeah.
The people who were framing the truckers as dangerous, as racist, as misogynist, as Nazis, as violent, and they weren't any of these things. It was a peaceful protest all the way through. It was families out in the streets celebrating, singing, dancing. They had bouncy castles. They were having hot dogs. Like it was actually very joyful and inspiring, and it made me feel hopeful about Canada for the first time in a long time. It was a show of unity and a show of love for Canada and for Canadians. And what the left did was to spew hatred and to vilify. And they all did this from inside their apartments on their computers. These are people who are not working class. Some people call them the pajama class. The people who can work online, who can afford to stay home, whose businesses and livelihoods are not at risk, who are obviously comfortable at homes. They have houses, they have yards. They don't have much to worry about. I mean, I would find that life depressing. Like, I want to be out and around people. I'm supposedly of the laptop class, although I think I still count as working class considering my income. But, I have a level of privilege in that regard. I didn't have to worry about losing my job per se, or losing my business per se. I could still continue to work online. But for these people to vilify men and women who were fighting for the rights of everyone in Canada, these are our constitutional rights. These are our charter rights. They belong to everyone. This benefits every person in Canada. Why any person would fight against their own rights is beyond me. But these people demonstrated themselves to be so clueless and uncaring. They didn't know what was going on in the real world. I mean, in large part because they'd been locked up in their houses, self-imposed, in my opinion, because you could have I left. It's like, I'm not doing this. But, and glued to their algorithms. They created bubbles and they stayed in their bubbles, and they didn't attempt to escape those bubbles to see what others were doing or thinking or experiencing or what they had to say. And they didn't want to hear it. They wanted to shut it down, and they tried their best to shut it down. And I find it so hypocritical and so appalling, because these are the people who claim to speak for the marginalized, right?
Yeah.
Who claim to care about, equality, and claim to oppose the so-called fascists. And here they are acting like a bunch of fascists, and advocating authoritarianism and vilifying working class, marginalized people.
Have you signed up to become a Spike supporter yet? Spike Supporters is our thriving donor community. Supporters can get access to a host of perks, and I have an extra special one to tell you about. On Monday, the 19th of December at 7 p.m, we have the brilliant Toby Young joining me for a special live recording of this podcast, and it is exclusive to Spiked supporters. Toby and I will be digging down into cancel culture, free speech, and much more. You'll be able to watch the recording online, plus we'll also be taking questions from the audience. So if you're already a Spiked supporter, you can register for the live podcast now in the Spiked Supporters Hub. If you're not a Spiked supporter, you can sign up for as little as £5 a month by going to spiked-online.com/supporters. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. Sign up today and claim your ticket for the live podcast on Monday the 19th. See you there. You know, one thing that's become clear to me over the past few years is that suddenly the mainstream left, or what now passes for the left, doesn't only misunderstand working class people and working class communities, which has been happening for quite some time, but as you say there, it's now actively hostile to working class people. And we see this across the board. We saw it in Canada. We saw it in the UK when lots of working class people voted to leave the European Union in 2016, and they were referred to as gammon, which is essentially pig meat. You know, these stupid, unintelligent, low information voters who've ruined everything by being so vulgar and reckless. We've seen it in the US, of course, with the basket of deplorables, Hillary Clinton's infamous phrase to describe certain people who voted for Donald Trump. And we see it across Europe as well. You know, many working class people are no longer voting for social democratic parties, which have now become the property of the upper middle classes. You can see this. It's measurable across Europe that social democratic parties are now run by upper middle class people and voted in large part by those people as well. And to my mind, one of the least surprising developments of the past decade has been the fact that working class people are voting for parties of the right, because the left has just treated them like shit, if you'll excuse my language, but that is what's happened. And on that, I wanted to ask you what hope there is for a new kind of politics that will speak to working people, that will speak to people like the Canadian truckers, like people in parts of Britain who feel left behind, like those people in the United States who obviously voted for Trump, not necessarily because they love him, but because they wanted some political instrument that they might wield against the old establishment. You said in your piece for Spiked on why you left the left that, you know, the pro-worker left is just not coming back. And I agree with that. I think that is now a historical artifact. That kind of left belongs in the history books and people will read about it for years, no doubt. Is there the possibility of a new kind of politics emerging that will take those people seriously? Is there a progressive strain that you think will start to treat the working classes with the respect that they deserve? Or is it going to be an uphill struggle to try and create something like that?
I think that we have to let go of left and right. And I think that we have to work towards, you know, for lack of a better term, a rational center. I don't think that center is a perfect term either. I sort of want to get out of this left, right, center categorization. But I mean, I think that people are desperate for that. You know, they're desperate for something real. The left is not working for the working class, and the right doesn't fit, you know, for a lot of people. If I lived in America, I probably would have voted for Trump, but I don't like Trump. I don't respect Trump. I don't think he's particularly intelligent. I don't think he's a respectable man. And no politician is going to be perfect. I mean, it's not reasonable to expect that you're going to have a politician that you like everything about and you agree with them on everything. They're still politicians at the end of the day, after all. But I think that people want something different. And I think people are desperate for authenticity, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I think that there are politicians out there that are respectable and that are fighting for something outside the left-right binary, although they have to work within it to a certain extent. You know, Tulsi, I like Andrew Yang a lot. In Canada, our Conservative Party isn't particularly right-wing. We've never had a strong right in Canada, or not as long as I've been alive in any case. We have a far-right party, the NDP. We have the Liberal Party, which is probably center-left, I suppose. And the Conservative Party, you know, the Conservative Party isn't like a pro-life party. It's not a religious party. It's not the same as the Republican Party in the US. And so there's members of the Conservative Party that I do like. I do like what they're saying, and I respect their positions on a lot of things, including free speech, and including, things like, climate change, our charter rights and freedoms, online hate speech. They've opposed Justin Trudeau's bill, an attempt to curb so-called online hate speech. In other words, his attempt to curb free speech. But I think that there's a backlash to the woke happening right now. And I think that those people are becoming louder and bolder. And I think that we will be able to advocate for something new and different. And I'm not fighting to change the minds of progressives and the anti-free speech feminists anymore. I've sort of given up on them to a certain extent. I tried for many, many, many years, and those people seem attached to their narratives and they want to be stuck in their ways. So leave them there and we can move on without them. Maybe they'll come around at a certain point. But I'm not going to waste my time haranguing them. And the feminists who tell me, or Posey Parker or whoever it may be, you can't ally with the right. Like, you can't work with these right-wing people. You have to just fight for the left. Why? These people hate me. These people disrespect me. These people don't respect women. It's pathetic. It's pathetic. It's like begging an abusive boyfriend to take you back. Why would I want anything to do with the Democrats? Why would I want anything to do with the Liberal Party? Why would I ever vote for a party who claims they cannot define what a woman is? It is insulting.
Yeah, it really is. And we see that with feminists in the UK, including gender critical feminists who are making very good arguments about same-sex rights and same-sex spaces and so on, who just cannot let go of the Labour Party or the broader Labour left, even though the Labour Party is led by a man, Keir Starmer, who cannot answer the question, can a woman have a penis? He cannot give a straight answer to that question. And if a party leader cannot answer that, the easiest question one could be asked, the answer is no, then you do wonder why they would trust him on anything else. So it is a bit tragic. And I think it will become a larger fault line as the trans issue possibly works itself out. I think we will see a larger divide between those in the gender critical movement who really have subscribe to the ideas of freedom and broader debate and rational discussion, and those who I think were involved in gender critical ideas because they were defending a particular feminist left ideology. And I think that will become an interesting split. Just a couple more quick questions for you, Meghan. You mentioned wokeness there. I did want to ask you about wokeness. I agree with you that there is a brewing backlash. There are millions of people in the Western world who would like to see the ideology of wokeness taken down a peg or two. I've always thought that, any political party that was to come out swinging against the ideology of wokeness while also making a serious case for improving the economic conditions of working communities, any party that combined those two worldviews would probably do incredibly well. The Conservative Party here in the UK tried to do it, but failed spectacularly. And I don't know of any other party that's actually doing that at the moment. But on wokeness, you're absolutely right that we've got to move beyond left and right. It's like using a dead language to navigate yourself through a new society. The left and right stuff just doesn't work. But in relation to wokeness, one of the things I find particularly frustrating is the way that wokeness is understood by many people to be left wing. That's what it means to be left wing. Whereas, of course, people like you and I would see wokeness as in some ways being anti the traditional left, anti the idea of being pro working class and pro freedom and pro equality. The real problem with wokeness is that it's just very reactionary, isn't it? It's a problematic ideology that will actively make people's lives worse.
I think so. I mean, part of the problem with wokeness is that it's very religious. We're dealing with something very similar to a cult. You have your positions, you have your mantras, you have your language. These are the things you say. You can't diverge from these mantras. And anyone who questions the mantras is ostracized. You're not allowed to think. It's an anti-critical thinking ideology, and it's a nonsense ideology. and it refuses personal accountability. It refuses, take charge of your own life and make it better. I think it's very victimizing, and I think it's very unempowering, which is strange because so much of that ideology came out of third wave feminism, which used the word empowering a lot, really overused the word empowering to describe things like, we were told in third wave feminism that selling sex could be empowering. That pornography could be empowering for women, that stripping could be empowering for women, that wearing stilettos was empowering for women, all these silly sexist things. And, that's not to say like wear high heels if you want, but it's not feminist. You're doing that because it makes you look hot. Like, just be honest. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with wanting to look attractive. I mean, it's so limiting. It makes people unintelligent. It seems to make people angry. It seems to rest on hatred, which is ironic because these people, you'll hear trans activists, people who are supposedly allies of the trans community, saying things like love is love and like no platform for hate. They held those signs, no platform for hate, outside my talk at the Toronto Public Library about women's rights. And they're being so hateful. They're threatening people. They're being violent in some cases. They're harassing, they're censoring, they're saying horrible, disgusting things about us. And they seem entitled to that hate, and they seem to have reframed it as love and acceptance, which is strange. But I think these people are not happy people, because I think that what makes you happy and comfortable with yourself is personal autonomy and freedom and, developing skills and living a happy, healthy life. And I think wokeness sort of promotes something opposite of that. I mean, we could get into all sorts of things like fat acceptance and, you feel depressed or anxious, so you should take a bunch of pills and lie on the couch for the rest of your life instead of, trying to change your diet and go to get some exercise and maybe try to do some things in your life or learn some skills that will make you feel proud of yourself and feel confident in life. I think it's very unhealthy. And if I were a conspiracy theorist, it would seem as though it was attempting to breed a population of unhealthy people with low libidos who aren't going to find love and happiness, who aren't going to reproduce, and who aren't going to be able to fight back if they need to. They're taking, I'm going to sound like a crazy person now. So, take away all their guns. Justin Trudeau is trying to pass this anti-gun legislation in Canada, which I find quite hilarious because there is no gun problem in Canada. It's not like the US where there are shootings all the time. It's just not a thing that really happens in Canada. But even if it were, he's banning hunting rifles. He's banning guns that people use to shoot birds. It's really strange. And, the Liberal Party is working to make it easier to kill yourself, medically assisted suicide, so that he's working to make it so that minors can consent to medically assisted suicide if they're depressed, for example. It's just really all quite sick. And it's not leftist. It's not progressive. It's about doing what's cheap for the government, but also profitable. Say with harm reduction, like give everybody free drugs, but don't provide any mental health support. Don't make any mental health facilities. Don't provide beds where people can go where they can get clean. Just give them clean heroin or opiates. It doesn't look good.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the euthanasia stuff in Canada, I just find so creepy and disturbing. And as you say, the idea that this kind of thing is in any way left wing, the left used to be about fighting for a better life for everyone, not about killing people who are in some way seen as a burden on society, or their sickness is too much. We can't cope with it. Let's just dispatch them off this planet. I just find it horrifying. My last question for you, which follows on nicely from what you've just said there. Firstly, I agree with you on the unhappiness of woke people. I think that's so striking and very palpable. And there's a bitterness, and very often, as you point out, under the banner of opposing hate, and opposing hate speech, these people will engage in the most hateful form of activity. And J.K. Rowling is a perfect example of this. She's subjected to rape threats and death threats and vile abuse every day by the kind of people who probably have the rainbow flag in their bio and say love is love and all that kind of crap. I think one thing I wanted to ask you, you struck a little bit of a note of despair in what you were just saying there. I actually don't think one needs to be a conspiracy theorist to think that there are probably just instinctive efforts by our societies, not a conspiracy, but a kind of instinctive drive to, I think, pacify the population. And you do see that in the way in which more and more young people are on pacifying drugs for so-called mental disorders or ADHD. You see it in the way in which young people are discouraged from being brave, discouraged from taking risks, and encouraged to live in a bit of a cotton wool society. There are, I think, instinctive efforts by the rulers of society to have, I don't know, a metaphorically lobotomized public because it benefits them more. And I think you also see this in the idea of universal basic income, which would essentially be about putting millions of people out to pasture so that they can just live their sad little lives while the elites will be the productive wing of society. So there is a lot of that stuff going on. And following on from that, we both struck a note of despair there. I did want to ask you, as a final question, whether you're feeling optimistic or pessimistic about where politics is going, because we have talked about the good things that are happening. Working class communities are standing up for themselves. More people are opening their eyes to the importance of freedom of speech. But there are also, as we've described, bad things happening in our societies as well. So where do you fall down on feeling hopeful about society becoming more progressive and free and equal, or concerned that things might go in a bad direction for some time to come?
Well, I feel both ways. So I feel hopeful about politics because we can see that people are really getting sick of Trudeau and his Liberal Party and of the Democrats and their lies and their hypocrisy and their obvious elitism. And we can see more support for, I like Ron DeSantis. We can see support for conservative or politicians who are more supportive of freedom and rights and who are pushing back against all this stuff. People are getting really tired of the woke stuff and of the nonsense, to be frank. What we see in the news on almost a daily basis should be satire, but it's real.
Yeah.
It's like Bizarro World come to life, and people are just not having it anymore. And so I think that's positive. At the same time, I do worry that people are so complacent and that they trade in their rights for conveniences. They're like, well, it's convenient for me to find a date on a dating app, or it's convenient for me to just jack off to porn. It's convenient for me to just order Uber Eats and, stare at my Facebook feed or watch Netflix all night and not really try to do much more with my life, or not really try to challenge myself or break out of that bubble. I'm from Vancouver, and Vancouver people are very much in their bubbles. They very much don't want out. And I think I was like that for a long time. And you think of yourself as a very progressive, open-minded person, and yet you spend all of your time with people who are just like you.
Yeah.
And who are relatively privileged in the world and who really don't know very much about the world, but presume to know everything about the world. And who are very snobbish. Who look down their noses at people who are different than them, but pretend not to. I'm worried that people are so dependent on technology and so comfortable with that dependence. What happened over the past 2 years was scary because so many people went along with nonsense. So many people put on their masks. People are still, if you go to San Francisco, people are still wearing their masks. voluntarily. I remember people saying, I'm just going to keep my mask on forever. It keeps my face warm. The amount of people who just accepted a loss of rights because they were handed some money, right? In Canada, we all got COVID money. People were being given like $2,000 a month. And I think it's like, shut up money. And now you're at home, you're comfortable, you have your money, you've got all your stuff. Like Amazon is delivering all your stuff to you daily. You don't need to leave the house. We're helping you. This is for your health. It's for your own good. And people went along and didn't ask questions and then made the people who did ask questions out to be criminals. And it was really frightening.
Meghan Murphy, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk with you again.